In the early American colonies, the smell of baking bread was more than comfort, it was survival. Every household depended on it, and every community measured its rhythm of life by the loaves that came out of warm hearths. Baking was not as simple as slipping dough into an oven. It required patience, strength, and skill, grinding grain, kneading by hand, tending to fire, and waiting as slow heat transformed raw ingredients into nourishment. Tonight, we step quietly into that world, into kitchens lit only by flickering firelight, where heavy wooden troughs held dough, and clay or brick ovens glowed with heat. We will explore how colonists turned grain into daily bread, how neighbors shared ovens, and how this simple act held families and communities together. So settle in. Let the gentle story carry you back in time. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these calming journeys alive. Before a single loaf of bread could be placed upon the rough-hewn tables of the early American colonies, an entire world of labor had already unfolded. Bread was the final step in a chain that began in fields stretching beyond wooden fences, where wheat, rye, barley, and maize swayed in the breeze. Each kernel of grain represented months of work, and each harvest carried the weight of survival for families whose lives depended on turning soil into sustenance. The story of bread, then, was not only the story of baking but the story of cultivation, patience, and transformation, a journey that began in the earth and ended at the hearth. In the colonies, fields were small compared to the vast farms of later centuries. Families worked patches of land cleared from forests, where stumps sometimes still jutted from the ground, and stones had to be removed each season. The work of planting was done by hand. Colonists scattered seed across furrows carved by wooden plows, often pulled by oxen. The soil was rocky, the weather unpredictable, and the labor unending. Grain was not simply grown. It was fought for, coaxed out of the land by sweat, muscle, and determination. Wheat, though cherished, was not always easy to cultivate. The soil of New England, thin and stubborn, favored rye and barley more than wheat, which grew better in the richer soils of the middle colonies. Maize, or Indian corn, provided a more reliable yield, taught to the colonists by native peoples who had cultivated it for centuries. Still, families dreamed of wheat bread, lighter and whiter than loaves of rye or maize. To have wheat was to taste a reminder of Europe, to feel connected to traditions carried across the ocean. Yet, whether wheat or rye, barley or corn, the grain that filled the family's sacks carried hope, for bread meant nourishment, and nourishment meant survival. Once harvest time arrived, fields filled with the sound of sickles cutting stalks, of hands binding sheaves, of wagons groaning under the weight of golden bundles. Harvest was a communal act, sometimes neighbors joining together, knowing that speed was essential before storms ruined the crop. In those weeks, families rose before dawn and worked until dusk, cutting, binding, stacking. The smell of cut grain hung in the air, sharp and sweet, while children helped gather loose stalks or fed animals in between. For the colonists, harvest was not only labor but also a celebration, for the sight of full barns meant the promise of bread through the coming winter. But cutting grain was only the beginning. The kernels had to be freed from their husks through threshing, a task done with flails on barn floors. Colonists beat the stalks rhythmically, the thuds echoing like drums, until grain loosened and fell. Dust and chaff filled the air, coating hair and clothes, while sweat trickled down faces bent to the work. The kernels were then winnowed, poured from baskets so the wind could carry away the lighter chaff, leaving the heavier grain behind. Even in this simple act, skill mattered. How high to pour, how strong the wind, how steady the hand. A misstep could waste precious food, and no family could afford waste. Once threshed and winnowed, the grain had to be stored with care. Dampness or pests could destroy months of labor in days. Colonists kept their harvest in barrels, bins, or sacks, sometimes hanging them from beams to deter rodents. The granary was a place of pride and vigilance, for it held the family's survival. Each scoop of grain taken from it was measured with caution, for it had to last until the next harvest. Bread, in this sense, was always bound to time. Each loaf eaten was one less step between the family and hunger before the cycle began again. But grain was not yet bread. To become flour, it had to be ground, and this step turned families outward to mills, those essential structures that dotted the landscape of colonial towns. Mills were the lifeline of communities, their water wheels turning with the force of rivers, their grinding stones shaping grain into powder. A trip to the mill was both necessity and ritual. Families loaded sacks onto carts or slung them across horsebacks, then made the journey along dirt roads or paths through woods. Waiting at the mill could take hours, as neighbors gathered with their own sacks. The sound of the stones inside was constant, a low, heavy grind, punctuated by the creak of wood and the rush of water outside. For many, the mill was the heart of the community. News traveled there, stories were exchanged, agreements were struck. While the grain was ground, families stood together, talking of weather, crops, and prices, of neighbors and distant wars. Children played along the banks while adults watched the slow turn of the wheel. Grain was transformed not only into flour, but into connection, each trip binding families more closely into the fabric of their settlement. When the flour finally returned home, its texture and quality depended on the miller's stones and the grain itself. Coarse flour, dark with bits of husk, was common, producing heavy loaves. Finer flour, lighter and smoother, was prized, used for special occasions or by wealthier households. Most families lived with the hearty breads of rye or cornmeal, their loaves dense and filling, strong enough to sustain workers in fields or shops. Yet whether fine or coarse, the flour was precious, for it meant that bread was possible, that the long journey from field to sack to stone had been completed back in the home. The flour was stored carefully, sometimes in wooden bins, sometimes in cloth sacks hung from rafters. Women, who bore the daily responsibility of baking, measured it with precision. Too much wasted flour meant hunger later. Too little made a loaf unsatisfying. Every handful mattered. With the flour in hand, the family stood on the threshold of the final transformation, the making of dough, the tending of fire, the waiting for bread to rise and bake. This journey from field to flour was a reminder of the fragility of life in the colonies. A storm at harvest, a poor yield, a broken mill wheel, an infestation of pests, each could break the chain, leaving families without bread. Yet it was also a reminder of resilience. Each loaf that emerged from the hearth was not only the product of that morning's baking, but of months of planting, tending, harvesting, threshing, winnowing, and grinding. Each slice eaten carried with it the labor of fields and barns, the rhythm of flails on the floor, the sound of millstones grinding, the patience of storage. And so, bread in the early American colonies was never taken for granted. It was more than food. It was the visible result of time, work, and endurance. To tear a piece from a loaf was to taste the field, the mill, the hearth. The journey of grain was long, but it was essential, and each family knew that in those kernels, small and humble, lay the foundation of life itself. Once the grain of the harvest had been transformed into flour, the work of bread-making passed into the hands of those who shaped the daily rhythms of the household, most often women, whose labor at the hearth gave form to sustenance itself. In the early American colonies, the act of baking began long before the fire was lit or the loaves were set in the oven. It began with the careful mixing of ingredients, the slow kneading of dough, and the watchful preparation that turned a sack of flour into food that could nourish a family. If the journey from field to mill had been about toil and patience, this stage was about skill, intuition, and the art of transforming raw substance into life. Flour alone could not make bread. It needed water, salt, and some form of leavening. In wealthier households, where imported yeast or beer barm, the frothy residue from brewing, could be obtained, loaves rose high and airy. But in many colonial kitchens, yeast was captured from the air itself, cultivated from the wild, or preserved in small lumps of fermented dough saved from previous batches. This practice, sometimes called sourdough, gave bread a tangy flavor and a dense texture, and it connected each new loaf to those that had come before it, a living chain of continuity stretching across days and weeks. Every family had its own methods, its own secrets of leavening, passed down through generations or learned by trial and error at the hearth. The mixing of ingredients was not done lightly. Flour was measured with care, often by eye or by handful, for precise scales were rare. Water was warmed to the right temperature, neither too hot to kill the yeast nor too cold to slow its growth. Salt, precious and sometimes expensive, was added sparingly, both to flavor the loaf and to strengthen the dough. In some households, a spoonful of molasses or honey was stirred in, not for luxury, but for nourishment, as these sweeteners added strength and calories to the bread. Each ingredient carried weight, not only in taste, but in survival, and every step was deliberate. The mixing itself was physical, demanding effort and endurance. Dough began as a sticky mass, clinging to fingers and troughs, resisting the pull of hands. In wooden bowls or on long tables, women worked the dough with patience, pressing, folding, turning, and pressing again. The rhythm of kneading became a rhythm of life, steady and strong, sometimes lasting half an hour or more. Muscles ached, but hands grew skilled, learning to feel the moment when dough transformed from sticky chaos into smooth elasticity. This knowledge could not be written on paper, but was carried in memory and touch, passed from mother to daughter, from neighbor to neighbor, each pair of hands adding to the tradition. The kneading of dough was also accompanied by watchfulness. Too much flour could make a loaf heavy and dry. Too little left it slack and fragile. The temperature of the room mattered, for in winter the cold slowed fermentation, while in summer the heat could cause the dough to rise too quickly. In drafty cabins, dough was often placed near the hearth, covered with cloth to protect it from chill and insects. Sometimes it was tucked into beds still warm from sleeping, the heat of feathers and blankets helping the yeast to do its work. These improvisations were part of colonial ingenuity, a blending of necessity and creativity that kept bread on the table even in the harshest seasons. Waiting for the dough to rise was a test of patience. Unlike the modern world, where quick yeast shortened the process, colonial families often waited hours for the dough to swell. During that time, other chores filled the day: spinning, mending, tending animals, fetching water. Yet the dough remained in mind, checked again and again, touched gently to see if it had doubled, watched for signs of bubbles beneath the surface. Bread making was never separate from daily life. It was woven into it, a task that demanded attention even while other tasks pulled at the hours. When the dough had risen enough, it was punched down, reshaped, and sometimes divided into loaves. In some households, dough was placed into wooden or clay pans, giving shape and support. In others, it was simply molded by hand, rounded or elongated, ready to rest again before baking. Occasionally, loaves were marked with cuts or symbols, not only for beauty but to guide the way they expanded in the heat. These marks also served as signatures, identifying whose loaf was whose when communal ovens were used, a reminder that bread was both personal and social, tied to identity as well as sustenance. Communal ovens were a central part of many colonial towns, especially in places where households lacked their own brick structures. Women carried their prepared dough through the streets, balancing trays or baskets, their loaves covered to protect them from dust and eyes. At the oven, they placed their bread alongside that of neighbors, trusting the baker to tend them in turn. The marks cut into the dough told each family's story, and when the loaves emerged, golden and steaming, they were returned to their rightful homes. In these moments, bread making became a shared act, binding communities through heat and flour. For families who baked at home, the hearth was the center of the process. Some cabins had clay or brick ovens built into their fireplaces, while others used simple Dutch ovens, heavy cast iron pots buried in coals, their lids heaped with embers. Both methods required skill. A brick oven had to be heated hours before baking, filled with blazing logs until the walls glowed red, then cleared of ash so the dough could be slid inside. Dutch ovens demanded constant attention, coals replenished above and below to keep the heat steady. In either case, the baker needed experience, for no thermometer guided the way. Only the feel of the heat, the sound of the crackling fire. The color of the oven's walls told when the time was right as the dough was prepared for the final step. The air in colonial kitchens filled with anticipation. Children hovered, noses eager for the smell of baking, while adults measured time by instinct and experience. To prepare bread was to prepare life itself, to take what the fields had given and shape it into sustenance. Each step of mixing, kneading, and tending was part of a ritual older than memory, carried across oceans, adapted to new lands, and repeated day after day, week after week. Bread in the colonies was not only food, but also reassurance. Each successful batch was proof that survival was possible, that despite the hardships of land and labor, warmth and nourishment could be found. The dough that rested under cloths or near hearths was more than dough. It was hope, swelling slowly, promising a future meal, a tomorrow with strength renewed. The act of preparing it, though demanding, carried with it comfort, a reminder that hands and time could transform raw grain into something sustaining and good. And so, the stage of mixing, kneading, and preparing the dough was not merely a mechanical step in bread making. It was the heart of the process, where flour became alive with yeast, where hands brought order to chaos, where patience and skill gave shape to nourishment. To watch the dough rise was to watch life itself unfold, fragile, slow, but steady, carried forward by care and intention. In those moments, the colonial kitchen became more than a place of labor. It became a place of transformation, where ordinary ingredients became extraordinary sustenance, where survival was baked into every loaf. Once the dough had been kneaded and left to rise, the focus of bread making in the early American colonies shifted to fire. Without fire, bread was impossible. Fire was heat, transformation, and life itself, but it was also unpredictable, demanding constant attention. To bake bread in the 18th century was to understand the nature of flames and embers, to respect their power, and to work in harmony with them. The hearth was the center of the home, the heart of its daily rhythms, and it was there, with smoke curling upward and coals glowing steadily, that the final stage of bread's journey unfolded. Colonial homes varied in size and wealth, but nearly all were built around their hearths. In the simplest cabins, a wide fireplace dominated the main room. In larger houses, kitchens were built as separate wings or buildings to reduce the risk of fire. But whether humble or grand, the hearth was indispensable. It provided warmth, light, and the means to cook. For bread, it provided both a workspace and an oven, though the form of that oven differed. Some families relied on Dutch ovens, heavy iron pots with flat lids that could be heaped with coals. Others had brick or clay bake ovens built into the side of the fireplace, their rounded chambers capable of holding several loaves at once. Both required skill, but the principle was the same: to capture the heat of fire and hold it long enough to transform dough into bread. The art of tending a fire began hours before baking. Wood had to be gathered and seasoned. Oak, hickory, or maple, chosen for their steady burn and heat. Damp or green wood was useless, filling the room with smoke and failing to heat the oven. Early in the morning, or even the night before, logs were placed inside the bake oven and set alight. The flames roared, heating the thick walls until they glowed faintly with absorbed warmth. In Dutch oven baking, a bed of coals was prepared in the fireplace itself. Glowing embers raked carefully to one side, while fresh wood fed the flames for the next batch. Judging the heat of the oven was a matter of experience, not instruments. There were no thermometers to tell the baker when the chamber was ready. Instead, bakers tested the heat by instinct. Some threw a pinch of flour onto the oven floor. If it blackened instantly, the oven was too hot, but if it browned slowly, the heat was right. Others held their hands near the mouth of the oven, gauging the intensity of the warmth. A few watched for the color of the bricks, knowing by their hue how much heat they held. These methods were learned through years of practice, passed from one generation to the next, and they demanded patience. Too hot, and the loaves would burn on the outside while remaining raw within. Too cool, and the bread would stay heavy, never fully baking. Once the oven was judged ready, the fire inside was raked out. Ashes and embers were swept away with long-handled tools, leaving only the stored heat within the walls. Loaves were then slid inside on wooden peels, their surfaces often dusted with flour to prevent sticking. The door of the oven, sometimes made of wood soaked in water or of iron, was sealed shut. For the next hour or more, the bread baked silently in the darkness, the heat of the clay or brick radiating evenly, surrounding each loaf. In that stillness, the transformation occurred. Dough expanded, crusts hardened, and the familiar aroma of baking filled the air. The Dutch oven method required even closer attention. After the dough was placed in the iron pot, the lid was fitted tightly and coals were heaped upon it, as well as beneath it. The balance of heat above and below determined the success of the loaf. Too many coals on top could burn the crust before the inside cooked. Too few below left the loaf pale and underdone. The baker had to check the coals, replenish them, and judge by instinct when the bread was ready. Smoke and heat stung the eyes, soot clung to clothes, and arms grew weary from lifting heavy lids. Yet the reward was a golden loaf. Rich with the taste of fire and labor, the hearth itself was a demanding companion. It consumed wood constantly, requiring a steady supply chopped and stacked by men or boys of the household. Sparks flew easily, so every movement had to be careful. Fire was useful, but it was also dangerous, and many kitchens bore scars of burns or near disasters. Yet despite the risks, families trusted their hearths, for they had no choice. Without fire, there was no bread, and without bread, there was no survival. Communal bake ovens offered relief to some households. In towns and villages, shared ovens reduced the burden of maintaining large hearths at home. On baking days, women carried their dough through the streets, the loaves marked with slashes or initials so they could be identified later. At the oven, the baker arranged them side by side, filling the chamber with loaves from many households. When the baking was done, each family collected its share, steaming and fragrant. This practice not only conserved resources, but also strengthened community ties. Neighbors met, shared news, and compared loaves, their conversations as warm as the bread itself. The art of tending the hearth was also about rhythm. A single firing of an oven could bake not only bread but pies, puddings, and roasts. Bread went in first, when the oven was hottest, followed by other dishes as the heat declined. In this way, no warmth was wasted. The day's cooking unfolded like a symphony, each dish following the other, each hour marked by the careful management of fire. Baking bread, then, was not an isolated act but part of a larger dance of heat and timing, a cycle repeated week after week in colonial kitchens. The sensory experience of baking was unforgettable. The crackle of wood as it burned, the glow of embers shifting in the hearth, the whoosh of flames when logs caught fire, all were part of the atmosphere. The The smell of bread rising in the oven mingled with the smoky scent of wood, filling the house with anticipation. Children leaned close, drawn by the fragrance, their stomachs growling as the minutes passed. Adults, weary from work in the fields or shop, found comfort in that aroma, knowing that soon they would tear into loaves still warm, their crusts crisp, their interiors soft. But behind the comfort lay constant labor. To bake bread was to commit hours, sometimes an entire day, to fire and dough. It required waking early to light the oven, kneading before sunrise, tending coals through the morning, and watching carefully for signs that the bread was ready. Burned loaves could not be undone, and underbaked loaves risked spoiling quickly. Each error meant not just disappointment, but danger, for bread was the foundation of the colonial diet. A mistake could leave a family short of food, a sobering reminder that baking was not just domestic art, but survival skill. And yet, when the loaves emerged, the effort felt worthwhile. Golden crusts cracked under fingers, steam curled upward, and the first slice revealed the miracle of transformation. Flour and water, yeast and fire, turned into nourishment. Around the hearth, families gathered, sharing the reward of labor. Bread was broken, butter spread, bowls of stew filled. The meal was not grand, but it was sustaining, and in those moments, the hardships of fire and toil faded into the satisfaction of warmth and fullness. The art of tending the hearth, then, was not simply about baking bread. It was about living with fire, respecting its power, and learning to guide it with patience. It was about community, whether in shared ovens or in families gathered around their hearths. It was about continuity, carrying forward methods taught by parents and neighbors, linking one generation to the next. Each loaf baked in colonial America carried not only the flavor of grain and fire, but also the imprint of centuries of tradition. A lineage of bakers stretching back to Europe and beyond. In the end, the hearth was both tool and symbol. It demanded constant labor, but it gave back life. It stood at the center of the home, warming, cooking, protecting, and reminding families each day of the balance between fragility and resilience. To tend the hearth was to tend life itself, and nowhere was this more clear than in the act of baking bread, when fire and flour met in the quiet alchemy of sustenance. When bread finally emerged from the hearth, golden and fragrant, its journey was not yet complete. For in the early American colonies, bread was never just food. It was a centerpiece of daily life, a measure of sustenance, and a reflection of community, culture, and survival. Loaves shaped the rhythm of meals, guided the routines of households, and carried meanings that extended far beyond nourishment. To break bread was to live, but also to connect with family, with neighbors, with traditions both old and new. In most colonial homes, bread was eaten at every meal. Breakfast might consist of thick slices of bread dipped into milk, spread with butter, or topped with whatever preserves could be made from the garden. For those working in the fields, bread provided the fuel to endure long hours of labor, its dense texture filling the stomach and giving energy. At midday, bread accompanied stews or broths, serving as a spoon, a plate, and a means to soak up every last drop. By evening, when the family gathered around the table in the dim glow of firelight, bread again appeared, passed from hand to hand, grounding the day's meal with familiarity and comfort. The kinds of bread varied with geography and circumstance. In New England, where wheat was difficult to grow, rye and corn were common. Brown bread, a mixture of rye and Indian cornmeal, was dense and hearty, often steamed or slowly baked in covered pots. It was filling, practical, and uniquely suited to the harsh climate and soil. In the middle colonies, where wheat flourished more easily, lighter loaves appeared, closer to the white bread remembered from Europe. In the South, corn remained central, with cornbread, ash cakes, and hoe cakes forming staples of daily diets. These regional differences reflected not only the land, but also adaptation, as colonists shaped their bread to what their environment could provide. Bread was more than a matter of taste. It was a matter of survival. Families measured their security by the flour in their bins and the loaves on their tables. A poor harvest, a spoiled sack of grain, or a fire that ruined an oven could mean hunger. For this reason, bread was never wasted. Stale loaves were softened with milk, turned into puddings, or crumbled into soups. Every crumb mattered, for each crumb represented the labor of fields, mills, and hearths. In a world where famine was never far from memory, the presence of bread offered reassurance, a visible symbol of plenty in uncertain times. Bread also carried social meaning. The type of bread on the table could signal wealth, status, or circumstance. White bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour, was associated with refinement and privilege, for wheat was more expensive and difficult to cultivate in the colonies. Coarser loaves, made from rye or corn, were the bread of common households, heavy and dark but sustaining. To serve white bread at a gathering was to display prosperity. To serve brown bread was to show thrift and practicality. Yet over time, colonists learned to take pride in their local breads, finding identity in the loaves that reflected their new land. Communal life often revolved around bread. Neighbors gathered to share ovens, to exchange yeast starters, or to trade flour when one household fell short. At community events, barn raisings, harvest celebrations, or church gatherings, bread was ever present, passed among many hands. Breaking bread together was a sign of unity, a reminder that survival was not an individual effort, but a shared endeavor. Even strangers could be welcomed with bread, its presence a universal gesture of hospitality. Bread also traveled beyond the home. Workers carried it into fields, wrapped in cloth to keep it clean, sometimes paired with cheese or dried meat. Children carried slices in their pockets, nibbling between chores or lessons. Soldiers marching to distant battles carried hardtack, a form of bread baked hard and dry to last for months, though its taste was far from pleasant. Traders carried loaves on journeys, for bread was portable, filling, and dependable. Wherever colonists went, bread went with them, linking home and hearth to the wider world. The spiritual weight of bread was felt even outside religious contexts. It was tied to the idea of fairness, of justice, of livelihood. To deprive someone of bread was to deprive them of life itself. In disputes over wages, rents, or harvests, bread often stood as the ultimate measure of sufficiency. A fair day's work meant enough bread for the family. An unjust system was one in which bread was lacking. To secure bread was to secure dignity and stability. The act of slicing and sharing bread carried quiet rituals. In many households, the loaf was placed at the center of the table, the head of the family cutting the first piece and distributing it. This act symbolized responsibility and care, a reminder that bread was not just for the self, but for all who sat together. Children learned respect through bread, waiting their turn, receiving their share. In this way, the loaf taught lessons of patience, order, and community as much as it fed the body. Over time, bread in the colonies also reflected the blending of cultures. Native peoples had long used corn in breads such as ash cakes, baked directly in the embers of a fire. Colonists adopted these practices, learning new methods to adapt to the land. Immigrants from Europe brought their own traditions. German settlers in Pennsylvania introduced hearty rye loaves. Dutch settlers contributed recipes for sweet rolls, and French Huguenots shared lighter breads. Each tradition mingled, creating a patchwork of flavors that reflected the diversity of colonial life. Bread thus became a symbol of cultural exchange, a meeting point between old worlds and new. Children grew up with bread as their first solid food, softened with milk, and as their constant companion through childhood. They associated its taste with comfort, its smell with home. For them, Bread was a measure of security, the reassurance that, despite hardship, there was something to eat. For adults, bread meant endurance, the strength to labor and survive. For elders, it meant continuity, a link between past traditions and the future of their descendants. In each stage of life, bread carried meaning, reminding all of their dependence on soil, fire, and one another at tea times of celebration. Bread became more than daily sustenance. Sweetened loaves appeared at weddings, feasts, or holidays, enriched with dried fruit, honey, or spices if they could be afforded. These loaves were rare, treasured, and eagerly anticipated. To eat such bread was to taste joy, to feel abundance in a world where scarcity was common. In sorrow, too, bread remained. Simple loaves served at gatherings after loss, their presence. A comfort to the grieving, a reminder that life continued, that nourishment endured even in mourning. The centrality of bread in colonial life cannot be overstated. It was the foundation of meals, the currency of labor, the expression of culture, the bond of community. It taught lessons of thrift and patience, of sharing and survival. To see a loaf cooling on a wooden board was to see security embodied, to feel the satisfaction of labor rewarded. In its crust and crumb lay the story of the land itself, shaped by soil and climate, by hands and hearths. Thus, daily bread in the colonies was not simply food, but a way of life. It wove itself into every hour, every household, every community. Each loaf told a story, of fields planted, of grain milled, of dough kneaded, of fire tended, of families gathered. To eat bread was to partake in history itself, to consume not only nourishment, but memory, tradition, and connection. In the colonies, where survival was never guaranteed, bread was the constant companion, the quiet anchor, the humble yet profound foundation of daily existence. In the early American colonies, bread was more than a household staple. It was also a bridge that connected families to one another, a daily thread woven through the fabric of community life. While each home might have its own hearth, the act of baking often extended beyond private kitchens. Shared ovens, the exchange of recipes and yeast, and the collective rituals surrounding bread revealed how essential cooperation was in a world where survival depended on unity as much as on individual effort. Bread carried with it the power of connection between neighbors, between cultures, and between generations to eye in many small towns and villages. The construction of a communal bake oven was one of the first acts of settlement. Built of brick or clay, these large ovens stood at the heart of communities, sometimes near a meeting house, sometimes in a central square. They were designed to hold dozens of loaves at once, heated by great fires stoked for hours until the thick walls absorbed and radiated heat. Families who lacked the resources for their own ovens relied on these shared spaces, bringing their prepared dough at appointed times. The oven became a place of gathering, where women, children, and even men lingered, waiting for their loaves to finish baking, exchanging news, stories, and assistance while the bread browned inside. The system of shared ovens required both trust and order. Each family marked their loaves with distinctive cuts or symbols before baking: a crosshatch, an initial, a unique slash. These marks were essential, for when dozens of loaves emerged golden and steaming, the community needed to know whose was whose. Mistakes could lead to quarrels, for every loaf mattered, and no one could afford to lose their bread. Yet for the most part, the system worked because neighbors relied on one another. The communal oven was not only a tool of efficiency, but also a symbol of interdependence, showing that bread was something greater than sustenance alone. It was a shared responsibility. The exchange of yeast was another way bread tied communities together. In an age before packaged yeast, families preserved leavening from previous batches of dough, sometimes passing portions to neighbors who had lost theirs. A fire that destroyed a home, a failed attempt at fermentation, or even simple forgetfulness could leave a household without yeast. In such moments, generosity mattered. A neighbor's small gift of starter dough ensured that another family could bake again. These exchanges built bonds of gratitude and obligation, reinforcing the sense that no family stood alone. Even the act of passing dough was intimate, for it carried with it the living cultures that sustained daily bread. A reminder of the interconnectedness of life itself. Traditions surrounding bread also reflected the blending of cultures that defined colonial society. Immigrants brought with them recipes and methods from their homelands, and these traditions slowly mingled into the colony's culinary landscape. German settlers in Pennsylvania favored dense rye loaves, often baked in long shapes and flavored with seeds. Dutch households made sweet rolls enriched with sugar or spices when they could afford such luxuries. French Huguenots contributed lighter breads and delicate pastries. English settlers relied heavily on wheat when possible, producing round loaves reminiscent of those at home. Native peoples introduced colonists to breads made of maize, baked on hot stones or in ashes. Over time, these traditions intertwined, neighbors sharing techniques and flavors, shaping a distinctly colonial bread culture that reflected diversity and adaptation. Bread also became part of rituals of exchange beyond food. It served as a gift, a token of goodwill, or a gesture of hospitality. A freshly baked loaf offered to a new neighbor signaled welcome. Bread brought to a family in mourning carried with it comfort and solidarity. At celebrations, bread was shared as a symbol of abundance, a visible sign that joy should be multiplied and distributed. These gestures gave bread meaning beyond nourishment. Each loaf carried the imprint of care, showing that to give bread was to give a piece of one's labor, time, and sustenance. Markets and fairs provided another stage for bread's role in community life. While much bread was baked at home, surplus loaves or special varieties sometimes found their way to stalls and tables, exchanged for other goods. At these gatherings, bread traveled farther, reaching those who lacked the means to bake or the time to tend ovens. Such exchanges revealed the dual nature of bread, both personal and public, a private labor of the hearth and a commodity that could circulate within a wider economy. In this way, bread linked households not only to neighbors, but to broader networks of trade and commerce. The act of eating bread together also reinforced community bonds. At barn raisings, harvest gatherings, or meetings in town, bread was always present. Long tables were covered with loaves, their slices served alongside stews, cheeses, and meats. In these moments, bread acted as the great equalizer, shared by all regardless of wealth or status. A wealthy family might have whiter loaves, a poorer one darker, but when bread was broken in company, the differences blurred. To eat together was to affirm unity, to remember that survival in the colonies was communal, not solitary. The symbolic power of bread extended into the ways communities taught their children. Young ones learned early that bread was precious, that waste was shameful, and that sharing was honorable. A child carrying a slice to school or into the fields carried not only food, but also the lessons of thrift, labor, and community. Parents reminded them of the effort behind each crumb: the planting, harvesting, grinding, kneading, and baking, instilling respect for both the food and the people who made it possible. In this way, bread became a tool of moral education, shaping the values of future generations. In times of hardship, bread's role in the community grew even more apparent. When harvests failed or flour grew scarce, neighbors leaned on one another. Communal ovens baked smaller loaves, carefully divided. Families shared what little they had, recognizing that survival depended on generosity as much as on labor. Bread shortages tested bonds, but they also revealed resilience. Communities that could cooperate endured. Those that hoarded or divided suffered greater loss. Bread thus became both a test and a testimony, showing whether people could rise together in adversity. Even in moments of conflict, bread carried unifying power. Disputes over land, politics, or trade might divide neighbors. But at the communal oven or the shared table, such differences softened. The necessity of bread reminded all of the deeper ties that bound them. A loaf rising in the oven did not belong to one faction or another. It belonged to the community's survival. The act of breaking bread together, even in strained times, acted as a silent call to cooperation, a reminder that some things were greater than quarrels. The traditions of bread in the colonies foreshadowed the patterns of American life that would follow. The emphasis on sharing resources, blending cultures, and valuing both independence and interdependence became hallmarks of the emerging nation. Just as bread required both individual effort and collective support, so too would the society that grew from these colonies. The humble loaf, born of flour and fire, symbolized the balance between self-reliance and community, between the labor of the household and the strength of the group. Bread in colonial America was not merely baked, eaten, and forgotten. It was carried forward in memory, ritual, and exchange. It tied neighbors together, shaped cultural identity, and embodied the spirit of cooperation. In every shared oven, in every exchanged starter, in every loaf passed as a gift, bread whispered the same lesson. Survival was never solitary. It was always shared, and so, in the daily life of the colonies, bread stood at the center, not only of tables, but of communities. Its role went beyond sustenance to embrace connection, tradition, and trust. To bake bread was to affirm one's place in the community, to contribute to the collective rhythm of life. To eat bread together was to strengthen the bonds that made survival possible. In this way, each loaf baked in early America carried more than grain. It carried the weight of unity, the strength of tradition, and the promise of shared endurance. Bread in the early American colonies was never guaranteed. Each loaf that emerged from the hearth was not only a triumph of skill and labor, but also a quiet victory over the constant threat of scarcity. Colonists lived in a world where poor harvests, harsh winters, pest infestations, and disruptions in trade could turn abundance into hunger with alarming speed. In those fragile circumstances, bread became more than daily sustenance. It became a measure of survival itself, a symbol of endurance when resources ran thin and hope seemed difficult to hold. Scarcity began in the fields. A single season of drought, too much rain, or early frosts could devastate crops. Wheat, already difficult to grow in much of New England's rocky soil, often failed, forcing families to rely on rye, barley, or corn. Even these hardier grains were vulnerable to weather and insects. Locust swarms or rust diseases could sweep across a field and leave little behind. In those moments, families looked with dread at empty granaries, knowing that the coming months would test their resourcefulness and resolve. When harvests disappointed, flour became precious. Each scoop from the barrel was measured carefully, each loaf stretched as far as possible. Families learned to make do with substitutes, blending cornmeal with rye, stretching dough with potatoes or pumpkin, or baking smaller loaves less often. Bread that once had been hearty and filling grew thinner and coarser. Darker loaves became the norm, not by choice but by necessity, each bite a reminder of the fragility of abundance. Yet, even in scarcity, colonists clung to bread, for it remained the foundation of their meals, the food that could not be abandoned even when altered. Scarcity also came through the disruption of trade. Ships from England carried flour, sugar, and other staples, but storms, wars, or political tensions could cut off supplies. When imported wheat failed to arrive, colonists turned to local substitutes, their tables reflecting the reality of their isolation. During periods of conflict, shortages were particularly severe. Soldiers consumed large amounts of provisions, and military blockades sometimes starved entire towns of resources. Bread became harder, simpler, and more precious, a symbol of perseverance in the face of forces beyond individual control. Winter was the greatest test. When snow covered the fields and rivers froze, no fresh grain could be grown or milled. Families depended entirely on what they had stored in autumn. If supplies ran low, meals became smaller and loaves more meager. Children learned the pangs of hunger, their parents forced to ration portions carefully. Bread might be baked only once a week, eaten sparingly, every slice savored as though it were a feast. In the coldest months, survival often meant finding ways to stretch dough with whatever was available, from ground acorns to chestnut flour, from mashed root vegetables to wild seeds gathered in desperation. These substitutions produced bread that was coarse and sometimes bitter, but it kept families alive. Scarcity also changed the rituals of baking. On ordinary days, dough rose slowly in warmth near the hearth. In times of hunger, families sometimes skipped leavening altogether, baking flatbreads that required less flour and no precious yeast. These breads baked quickly and filled the stomach, if not the spirit. Ash cakes, made of cornmeal baked directly in the coals, became common when resources dwindled. While less refined than loaves baked in ovens, they served the purpose of survival, transforming what little remained into sustenance. Communities faced scarcity together. Shared ovens became even more important, conserving fuel and heat when resources were scarce. Neighbors traded flour, cornmeal, or yeast, ensuring that no family was entirely left without. Acts of generosity became lifelines. A small portion of grain given from one household to another could mean the difference between hunger and survival. In these exchanges, bread revealed its deeper role, not just as sustenance, but as a bond of humanity. Scarcity tested communities, but it also showed their strength, their willingness to endure together rather than apart. For children, bread in times of scarcity became a teacher of endurance. They learned that food was not guaranteed, that every crumb mattered. Parents reminded them of the labor behind each loaf, urging them never to waste. Even in lean times, the act of breaking bread carried lessons of gratitude, teaching that survival depended not only on labor, but also on respect for the gifts of the earth. Hunger etched these lessons deeply, shaping generations with an understanding of thrift and resilience. Scarcity also left its mark on memory. Families who endured a hard winter or a poor harvest remembered those times long after. They spoke of loaves stretched thin, of meals made of little more than bread and broth, of nights when hunger gnawed but bread still offered comfort. These memories carried forward, shaping how families planned for future years. Granaries were filled more carefully, loaves baked with greater awareness, waste guarded against fiercely. In this way, scarcity forged habits of caution and endurance that lasted far beyond the moments of hunger themselves. Even in hardship, bread carried dignity. To place a loaf on the table, however small or coarse, was to affirm survival. It was a declaration that despite scarcity, life continued, that families endured. A dark, dense loaf could still warm hands and fill stomachs, offering comfort even when luxuries had vanished. Bread carried with it not only calories, but hope, a reminder that tomorrow might bring better harvests, fuller granaries, and loaves baked with abundance once more. The role of bread in scarcity also reveals the resilience of colonial ingenuity. Families adapted recipes, invented substitutes, and shared resources. They refused to surrender the act of baking, even when circumstances forced changes in method and taste. This resilience mirrored the broader spirit of the colonies themselves. Communities determined to survive despite hardship, to find ways to endure through creativity and cooperation. Bread was a symbol of that spirit, humble but unyielding, shaped by necessity, yet carrying with it the promise of endurance in the quiet of winter nights. When loaves were small and meals thin, bread still connected families. Around the hearth, slices were divided carefully, each person receiving a portion. Conversations continued, laughter was shared, stories told, all while bread passed from hand to hand. Even in hunger, bread anchored life, a fragile but steady presence that reminded families of their bond to one another and to the land. In this way, scarcity, though painful, deepened the meaning of bread. It was no longer just nourishment, but the embodiment of survival itself. A symbol of resilience in a world where life was never guaranteed. And so, in times of scarcity, bread taught lessons that abundance could not. It revealed the fragility of life, the strength of community, the importance of thrift, and the resilience of spirit. It showed that even when loaves were smaller, darker, or coarser, they carried weight far beyond their size. Each loaf baked in hardship was a testament to endurance, to the will to survive, to the quiet determination of families and communities who faced hunger yet refused to give in. Bread in scarcity was not only food. It was hope, survival, and the unbroken promise of life. For the colonists who crossed the Atlantic in search of a new life, bread was more than a staple of their diet. It was a piece of home carried across the ocean, a symbol of identity rooted in centuries of tradition. Each culture that arrived on American shores brought with it not only language, customs, and memories, but also recipes and methods of baking that reflected its past. In the New World, bread became a place where memory and adaptation met. It retained the flavors of Europe while absorbing the realities of the colonies, creating loaves that were at once familiar and new. Through bread, colonists defined themselves, their families, and even their communities, linking who they were to what they ate in Europe. Bread had always carried meaning far beyond sustenance. In France, finely sifted white loaves were associated with nobility and wealth, while dark rye breads were linked to peasants and poverty. In England, bread varied from region to region, with some areas favoring round cottage loaves, others producing rectangular tin-baked bread. German regions boasted hearty rye breads, dense and tangy, often flavored with caraway or fennel. Dutch families baked sweet rolls, spiced loaves, and pastries rich with butter. Italians prized flatbreads and olive oil-based recipes. Each of these traditions spoke to geography, economy, and class, forming identities that were deeply ingrained in daily meals. When families left Europe for the New World, they did not leave these associations behind. They carried with them the memory of what bread should look like, taste like, and mean. For some, the longing for white wheat loaves was especially strong, for such bread symbolized refinement, prosperity, and continuity with life across the sea. Yet the soils of the colonies often resisted wheat, forcing adaptation. Families that once baked soft white loaves learned to work with rye, barley, or cornmeal, producing darker, denser breads than those they remembered. Over time, these loaves became part of their new identity, practical, resourceful, and distinctly colonial. The English, for instance, quickly discovered that maize, taught to them by native peoples, could be ground into meal and baked into loaves or flat cakes. These corn-based breads were unlike anything they had eaten at home, yet they became essential, filling gaps when wheat was scarce. Over generations, cornbread and johnny cakes became emblematic of the colonies themselves, foods that spoke of adaptation and survival in a land far different from the English countryside. Eating cornbread marked colonists as Americans as much as speaking English marked them as Europeans. German immigrants, particularly in Pennsylvania, maintained their traditions with remarkable persistence. They continued to bake rye breads, often using sourdough starters brought with them or developed anew in the colonies. Their loaves were dense, tangy, and deeply satisfying, offering comfort in an unfamiliar world. These breads carried not only sustenance, but identity, a reminder of the villages and valleys of the Old World. Over time, their methods influenced neighbors, spreading the popularity of rye and sourdough. blending German heritage into the broader colonial palate. The Dutch settlers, concentrated in New York and its surroundings, carried with them recipes for sweet, enriched breads, loaves flavored with cinnamon, nutmeg, or sugar when such luxuries could be afforded. Their New Year's loaves and spiced buns offered a taste of festivity, maintaining cultural rituals even as they adapted to new circumstances. Sharing these loaves with neighbors extended Dutch traditions outward, weaving them into the colony's identity as a place of diverse influences. French Huguenots, scattered across several colonies, contributed lighter loaves and delicate pastries. Though flour for fine white bread was often scarce, they sought to recreate the breads of their homeland whenever possible, holding on to a sense of refinement even in exile. Their influence, subtle but enduring, helped broaden colonial ideas of what bread could be, encouraging experimentation beyond the simple loaves of necessity for native peoples, whose traditions long predated European arrival. Bread looked very different. Cornbread, ash cakes, and other maize-based breads had sustained communities for centuries. When colonists adopted these methods, they absorbed not only a new food, but also a piece of indigenous knowledge that reshaped their survival. The blending of native techniques with European expectations created hybrid traditions, loaves that bore the imprint of both worlds. In this way, bread became a meeting place of cultures, reflecting both exchange and adaptation. The social meanings of bread also shifted in the colonies. In Europe, distinctions between white and brown bread had been tied closely to class. In America, while these associations remained, they blurred in the face of necessity. Wealthier households still prized wheat bread, importing flour when they could, but most colonists learned to embrace rye and corn as staples. Pride grew in these loaves, which came to symbolize resilience and independence rather than poverty. To eat cornbread was to affirm connection to the land, to claim identity as part of the new world rather than a copy of the old. Over time, bread in the colonies came to embody the diversity of its people. In towns, markets offered loaves of different kinds, reflecting the mingling of English, German, Dutch, French, and native traditions. A family might eat rye bread one day, cornbread the next, and a sweet roll on a holiday. This variety became a quiet expression of the colony's character, a place where cultures coexisted, blended, and reshaped one another. Bread was the common ground on which these exchanges took place. The universal food that carried different meanings for different groups, yet united them all in sustenance. Even the act of baking itself carried identity. Families passed down methods through generations, daughters learning from mothers how to knead, shape, and tend loaves. The smell of baking bread became associated with heritage, each kitchen echoing with traditions that tied the present to the past. In some homes, loaves resembled those of Europe closely, a deliberate attempt to preserve memory. In others, loaves reflected the land's realities, shaped by what could be grown and milled nearby. Both approaches expressed identity, one through continuity, the other through adaptation. For children growing up in the colonies, bread was their earliest taste of culture. They learned that their family's bread was not just food, but a marker of who they were and where they came from. A German child eating sourdough, a Dutch child nibbling sweet rolls, an English child biting into cornbread. Each tasted not only nourishment, but heritage. These early experiences shaped their sense of belonging, tying their identities to both ancestry and land. In times of scarcity, identity was tested. A family accustomed to white bread might find themselves eating only cornmeal, a humbling adjustment that blurred distinctions of class and culture. Yet even in these moments, bread carried meaning. To endure hunger together, to adapt recipes, to share loaves across differences, all became part of the colonial identity, one built not on rigid hierarchy, but on resilience and exchange. The shared experience of bread, in all its forms, created bonds that outlasted hardship. Bread in the colonies was thus never static. It evolved with each generation, reflecting both memory and change. It carried the weight of Europe, but also the imprint of America, creating loaves that were hybrids of old and new. Through bread, colonists expressed who they were, where they came from, and who they were becoming. It became a symbol of identity and transition, a daily reminder that life in the New World required both continuity and transformation. And so, as families broke bread in their cabins, taverns, and communal gatherings, they did more than eat. They affirmed their heritage, embraced their adaptation, and shaped the identity of a people in the making. Each loaf, whether rye, corn, wheat, or sweetened with spice, carried with it a story of journey, memory, and survival. From Europe to the New World, bread became a bridge between past and present, a symbol of who the colonists were and who they were becoming. In the quiet act of baking and eating, identity was both preserved and transformed, shaping not only households but the very character of a new society. Bread in the early American colonies may have appeared simple when it reached the table, a round, heavy loaf or a flat ash cake, steaming and fragrant, waiting to be sliced. Yet behind that loaf was a mountain of labor, a chain of effort that stretched across fields, barns, kitchens, and hearths. To tear a piece of bread in those times was to partake in hours, days, even months of work, the unseen toil of men, women, and children. Each stage, from planting to harvesting, grinding to baking, demanded not only skill but endurance, and it was this labor that gave bread its true weight in colonial life. The story began in the soil. Fields did not till themselves, nor did seeds leap into the earth without human hands. Colonists rose early, long before dawn, to begin their work. Men and boys guided plows through rocky ground, clearing stones and stumps left behind from forests newly cut. Wooden plows, drawn by oxen or horses, carved furrows, while hands scattered seeds in careful rows. Planting season was a race against time, for delays could mean crops that failed to ripen before frost returned. Every step in the field carried the weight of urgency, and every muscle remembered the cost of bread. Once planted, the crops required tending. Weeds threatened to choke young shoots, insects gnawed at leaves, and storms could flatten fields in a single night. Families worked constantly, pulling weeds, checking for pests, and repairing fences to keep animals from trampling their grain. The labor never ended, for the land was stubborn and required coaxing. The work of the field was hot, back-breaking, and uncertain, yet without it there would be no harvest, and without harvest, no bread. When harvest time came, the pace intensified. Men, women, and children all joined in cutting stalks with sickles, binding them into sheaves, and hauling them to barns. The rhythm of swinging blades filled the air, joined by the grunts of exertion and the creak of wagons loaded heavy with grain. Each bundle carried on shoulders, each cart pulled across uneven ground, was a reminder that bread demanded sweat before it ever reached the hearth. Harvest was exhausting, yet it was also hopeful, for the golden fields promised survival if gathered quickly enough. Threshing followed harvest, and with it another layer of toil. Barn floors echoed with the sound of flails, wooden tools wielded by strong arms to beat the grain from the stalks. Hour after hour, colonists swung, struck, and separated, dust rising thick in the air, chaff clinging to hair and clothes. The work was monotonous but vital, for every kernel mattered. Children helped gather the fallen grain. Women winnowed with baskets, letting the wind carry away the husks while the heavier kernels dropped back into their bins. The entire household joined in, united by the knowledge that bread depended on their effort. Grinding added still more labor. Though water and wind-powered mills eased the burden, families still had to load sacks of grain, carry them miles to the nearest mill, and wait their turn among neighbors. Roads were rough, wagons heavy, and the journey itself often consumed hours of the day. At the mill, the grinding stones thundered, turning grain into flour while colonists exchanged news, tended animals, or simply waited. When the flour was finally secured, it had to be carried home, stored carefully, and guarded against pests or dampness. Each step was labor, and each sack of flour represented not only grain but the weight of hands and backs that bore it. The labor of baking fell heavily on women, who carried the responsibility of transforming flour into daily sustenance. Their work began before dawn, when fires had to be lit, ovens heated, and dough mixed. Kneading required strength, pressing and folding sticky masses until smooth, lifting heavy pots, tending hot coals, and standing for hours near the hearth demanded stamina. Burns were common, smoke stung the eyes, and the heat of summer made kitchens nearly unbearable. Yet the work had to be done, for families relied on bread each day, and its absence could not be excused. Even children played their part. They fetched water from streams or wells, gathered kindling for fires, turned grindstones when mills were not available, and carried baskets of dough or loaves. Their small tasks eased the burden of adults, and through them they learned the rhythms of labor. Bread was not given freely. It was earned, and children understood from an early age that their effort mattered to the household's survival. The labor behind bread extended beyond households into communities. Millers worked long hours maintaining their stones. Bakers tended communal ovens, and farmers traded surplus grain for other goods. The economy of entire towns revolved around this shared labor, each person contributing in some way to the chain that produced bread. No single household could escape this work. It was part of life itself, binding everyone together in necessity that in times of plenty, the labor of bread was celebrated. Harvest festivals featured tables laden with loaves, the reward of months of toil. Families looked with pride at their granaries, knowing their labor had secured survival through the winter. Yet, even in abundance, the memory of labor remained. Each bite of bread carried with it an awareness of what had been spent to create it. The hours bent in fields, the blisters from kneading, the soreness of shoulders from hauling sacks. Bread tasted not only of flour and fire, but of effort, in times of scarcity. The labor of bread became heavier still. Poor harvests meant longer hours searching for substitutes, gathering wild plants, grinding chestnuts, or acorns to stretch dough. Families worked harder for less. Their bodies pushed to exhaustion to produce loaves that were smaller and coarser. Yet, even then, the act of labor carried meaning. To bake bread in hardship was to declare resilience, to affirm that life continued despite adversity. The labor itself became a form of hope, proof that survival was still possible if hands kept moving and hearts did not yield. The unseen toll of this labor was immense. Hands cracked from cold water, backs bent from endless bending, lungs filled with dust and smoke. Yet bread was never optional. It was the foundation of life, and so the labor behind it continued day after day, year after year. Colonists may have dreamed of easier meals, of foods less demanding, but they returned always to bread, for it was the one constant that sustained them. Bread thus carried within it the memory of labor. To slice a loaf was to slice through layers of effort, each crumb containing the work of fields, mills, and hearths. Colonists understood this deeply, which is why waste was so despised. To throw away bread was to throw away labor, to dishonor the sweat of those who had made it possible. Respect for bread was respect for work, and in this way, loaves became symbols not only of survival, but of human effort itself that in the end. Every loaf eaten in the early American colonies was more than nourishment. It was the product of a community's labor, the outcome of months of planting, harvesting, grinding, and baking. Behind each crust lay the strength of hands, the patience of waiting, the endurance of bodies pressed to their limits. Bread was life, but it was also labor, And in acknowledging the work behind every loaf, colonists affirmed both their survival and their shared humanity. When bread was placed on the table in the early American colonies, it was more than the final product of grain, fire, and labor. It was also a vessel of memory, carrying within its crust and crumb the stories of those who baked before, the lessons of hardship endured, and the rituals of family passed quietly from one generation to the next. In every loaf, there lived a kind of history, not written in books but whispered in kitchens, marked by the hands that kneaded, and preserved in the minds of children who watched and learned. Bread was sustenance, but it was also memory, a continuity of tradition that connected the present to the past. Families in the colonies often spoke of bread as they prepared it, teaching children not only how to measure and knead, but why these steps mattered. A mother might tell her daughter of the winter when wheat failed and the family survived only because cornmeal was stretched into ash cakes. A father might remind his son of the time neighbors shared yeast after their own starter had spoiled. These stories turned bread into more than food. They made it a living archive of endurance and generosity. The act of baking was itself an act of remembering, each batch carrying with it lessons from earlier struggles. Memories of bread were often tied to moments of scarcity and survival. Families recounted the year of drought when flour was rationed, or the harsh winter when only dark rye loaves could be baked. These memories were not shared as tales of despair, but as lessons in resilience, reminders that hardship could be endured when people worked together and adapted. Children who grew up with these stories carried them into adulthood, shaping their understanding of thrift, patience, and gratitude. Each slice of bread eaten in lean times was a reminder of those earlier trials, strengthening the memory of survival across generations. Bread also preserved cultural memory. Immigrants who arrived in the colonies carried with them the breads of their homelands, and through baking they kept alive a sense of identity. German settlers taught their children the tang of sourdough rye, reminding them of valleys left behind. Dutch families prepared sweetened loaves during holidays, telling stories of celebrations once held across the ocean. French Huguenots shaped delicate rolls, passing down not only recipes, but also the memory of traditions carried through exile. These loaves became edible histories, each bite connecting children to ancestors they had never met. Each recipe a thread tying the old world to the new, native peoples. 2. Passed on their own bread traditions through memory and practice. Corn cakes baked in ashes, loaves shaped from maize and beans, and other indigenous methods were taught within families and sometimes shared with colonists. These practices held stories of survival rooted deeply in the land, lessons in how to use its gifts with respect and balance. For native families, bread was part of cultural heritage, tied to rituals, seasons, and memory. When colonists adopted these methods, they unknowingly partook in traditions centuries old. Though the deeper stories often remained within native communities, bread was also central to personal memory, tied to the rhythms of childhood. A child might remember the smell of dough rising near the hearth, or the warmth of a slice fresh from the oven, butter melting into its surface. These sensory memories lingered long after, carried into adulthood as markers of home. Even those who left the colonies or traveled far remembered bread as the taste of childhood, the comfort of family, the symbol of belonging. A loaf was more than nourishment. It was a touchstone of memory, grounding people even when distance or time carried them away. Communal memory was built around bread as well. In villages where ovens were shared, the act of baking became an opportunity for storytelling. While loaves browned inside, neighbors exchanged tales of storms weathered, of harvests gained or lost, of ancestors who had taught them how to bake. These conversations wove bread into the collective memory of the community, each loaf carrying not only the labor of individuals, but the stories of many. Over time, the communal oven itself became a place of remembrance, where the scent of baking was always accompanied by the hum of voices recalling the past. Even rituals of marking loaves preserved memory. Families carved initials, symbols, or slashes into their dough before baking, ensuring that their bread could be recognized when removed from shared ovens. These marks became identifiers, but they also carried meaning. Some were passed down through generations, simple designs that linked loaves across time. To cut the same mark into dough that a grandmother once used was to participate in continuity, to remember her through the daily act of baking. These small rituals transformed bread into a record, its surface inscribed with memory as surely as ink inscribes a page. In times of joy, bread carried celebratory memories. Special loaves enriched with honey, dried fruit, or spices marked weddings, births, or holidays. Families remembered these breads long after the occasions, telling stories of the rare luxuries that made them possible, recalling the laughter and gathering that accompanied them. To bake such a loaf again was to revive the joy of earlier times, to connect the present moment to past happiness. Bread thus became a marker of both survival and celebration, recording life's extremes in its humble form. The memory of bread was also preserved in sayings, proverbs, and lessons. Parents reminded children that wasting bread dishonored the labor behind it. Elders told stories of hunger to teach gratitude for every crumb. Communities passed along wisdom in simple phrases about bread, that it was life, that it was not to be taken lightly, that it represented fairness and justice. These words echoed through generations, shaping how people thought of bread not just as food, but as a symbol of values. Through bread, memory became a kind of inheritance. Loaves carried stories of struggle, culture, joy, and endurance, passed from one generation to the next without needing books or records. A child who learned to bake also learned to remember, to honor the efforts of ancestors, to value the lessons of hardship, to respect the rhythms of tradition. In this way, bread became not only sustenance but history itself, alive in each household, whispered through recipes, and carried forward in memory. In the end, bread in the colonies was both nourishment and narrative. Each loaf told stories of family, of culture, of survival. It carried within it the labor of the present and the memories of the past, linking generations in a chain of continuity. When colonists broke bread, they broke open history, consuming not only flour and fire, but also the stories that sustained them. And so, bread endured not only as food, but as memory, a quiet archive preserved in kitchens, shared at tables, and passed through hands across time. As the story of bread in the early American colonies comes to its quiet end, we can see how something so simple, so ordinary, carried the weight of life itself. A loaf of bread was never only flour and water, yeast and fire. It was the field plowed at dawn, the seeds scattered by hand, the harvest gathered with aching muscles, the grain threshed and ground into flour, the dough kneaded with strength, the oven tended with care. It was hours and days of labor, folded into each crust, each crumb. Bread was survival, but it was also more. It was community, shared in communal ovens and passed from neighbor to neighbor in times of scarcity. It was memory, carrying with it the stories of hardships endured and joys celebrated, binding generations together in quiet continuity. It was identity, connecting the old world to the new, blending traditions from England, Germany, the Netherlands, France, and native peoples into loaves that reflected both heritage and adaptation. In every form, rye bread, corn cakes, brown bread, sweet rolls, bread whispered of where people came from and who they were becoming. At the hearth, bread was comfort. Its aroma filled kitchens with reassurance, reminding families that no matter how difficult the world outside might be, there was warmth and nourishment within. At the table, bread was unity. It was passed from hand to hand, divided among family members, neighbors, and strangers, turning meals into moments of connection. Even in scarcity, bread symbolized hope, the stubborn reminder that tomorrow could bring better harvests, fuller granaries, and stronger loaves. The legacy of bread is the legacy of endurance. Each loaf baked in the colonies carried with it the spirit of resilience, the will to survive in a land that was often harsh and unforgiving. Through bread, colonists preserved their traditions, taught their children the values of thrift and patience, and built communities grounded in cooperation. It was humble, but it was powerful. It sustained not only the body, but also the heart and memory of a people learning how to live in a new world. Tonight, as you drift into rest, imagine those quiet colonial kitchens, the glow of embers, the creak of wooden boards, the smell of loaves cooling on tables. Picture families breaking bread together, children nibbling at warm slices, neighbors gathering at communal ovens, stories shared as loaves browned inside. Each of those moments is gone, but their memory lingers in history's quiet corners, reminding us that even the simplest acts, planting, kneading, baking, sharing, carry meaning that lasts far longer than a single meal. And so the circle closes. Bread fed the colonies, shaped their communities, preserved their memories, and defined their identity. It remains a legacy not of grand monuments or famous names, but of ordinary hands, steady labor, and quiet endurance. In every loaf, we find not only food, but history. A history baked slowly, shared generously, and remembered always.